"Kneel before the royal crest," the overseer shouted, "unless you think a slave belongs beside a crown." Every eye in the crowded stone square turned toward 18-year-old Charlotte Hayes as she stood frozen beneath the towering clock tower at the center of Ashbourne. Her hands trembled, not because she feared punishment, but because the small silver emblem lying near her worn shoes looked strangely familiar. The polished crest had slipped from the pocket of a wealthy noblewoman only moments earlier, yet the instant Charlotte's fingers brushed its cool surface, a memory she could not explain flashed through her mind. It was not a complete memory, only the distant echo of a lullaby carried by warm candlelight and the gentle voice of a woman whispering that no matter where life carried her, she would always belong to the kingdom. The vision vanished as quickly as it appeared. Murmurs swept through the marketplace while merchants paused beside colorful produce stands and travelers lowered their luggage to watch the scene unfold. Charlotte slowly bent down, carefully lifted the emblem with both hands, and held it respectfully toward its owner. Instead of gratitude, she was met with disbelief. The noblewoman stared at Charlotte's face with unexpected confusion before quickly hiding her expression behind practiced dignity. For one impossible second, it almost looked as though she recognized the young servant. Charlotte had lived every one of her 18 years inside Greymoor Estate, where servants reminded her daily that she had been abandoned as an infant and rescued only out of charity. She scrubbed marble floors before sunrise, carried heavy baskets through endless hallways, and rarely stepped beyond the estate gates except to deliver supplies into town. She had never questioned the story because it was the only one she had ever known. Yet today, something felt different. As she handed back the crest, an elderly veteran standing near the fountain quietly removed his cap. His weathered eyes filled with emotion, and for reasons he could not explain, he instinctively bowed his head. A nearby flower seller noticed and frowned in confusion. The old man quickly straightened himself, pretending nothing had happened, but the moment lingered in Charlotte's mind. Why would a decorated soldier lower his head to someone everyone else called a servant? Before she could ask, the estate steward ordered her back to work. Charlotte gathered her basket and walked through the bustling streets, unaware that several strangers continued watching her long after she disappeared into the crowd. High above the city, inside the Royal Archives, investigator Ethan Ashford examined a collection of faded records that had remained untouched for nearly 2 decades. One document rested apart from the others, marked with a royal seal and a single unfinished sentence. Female heir, location unknown. Ethan studied the page in silence before looking toward the palace window overlooking Ashbourne. Too many forgotten details had begun resurfacing in recent weeks. A missing birth record, a vanished witness, a silver crest that should never have left the royal vault. Somewhere beyond those castle walls, a secret buried for 18 years had quietly begun searching for its rightful owner, even though Charlotte Hayes still believed she was nothing more than a forgotten servant with no place in history. The morning after the incident in the town square, Charlotte Hayes awoke long before sunrise, just as she had every day since she could remember. The stone floors of Greymoor Estate still held the chill of the night as she quietly carried a bucket of fresh water through the endless hallways. Every familiar task should have brought comfort through routine, yet her thoughts refused to settle. She could still see the silver crest in her hands and the strange expression on the noblewoman's face. More unsettling than that was the elderly veteran who had instinctively lowered his head. Nobody bowed to a servant. Nobody looked at a forgotten girl as though they were seeing a ghost from the past. Charlotte tried convincing herself that exhaustion had made her imagine everything, but the feeling only grew stronger as the day unfolded. While polishing the grand staircase, she noticed 2 elderly housemaids whispering near the entrance. The moment Charlotte approached, they immediately fell silent. One of them looked at her with watery eyes before quietly saying, "You have your mother's smile." Charlotte turned back in surprise. "My mother?" she asked softly. The woman suddenly realized what she had said, apologized awkwardly, and hurried away without another word. Charlotte stood motionless, staring after her. Nobody at the estate had ever spoken about her parents. The official story had always been painfully simple. She had been abandoned, rescued, and raised out of mercy. There had never been another version. Later that afternoon, the estate received unexpected visitors. Several royal officials arrived to inspect historical tax records stored inside the manor. Among them was investigator Ethan Ashford. Tall, composed, and observant, Ethan carried himself with quiet confidence rather than noble arrogance. While the estate owner proudly escorted the officials through expensive galleries and private libraries, Ethan seemed distracted by something else entirely. As he walked across the entrance hall, Charlotte appeared carrying a basket of freshly folded linens. Their eyes met for only a brief second, yet Ethan stopped walking. He studied her face with careful attention, not because he recognized her personally, but because something about her perfectly matched an old charcoal portrait he had examined inside the royal archives only hours before. Charlotte politely stepped aside to let the visitors pass, lowering her eyes as every servant had been taught. Ethan continued walking, but his thoughts remained fixed on the young woman. That evening, after returning to the capital, he unlocked a small wooden cabinet inside his office and removed a sealed leather folder labeled with faded handwriting. Inside rested sketches, faded letters, and the unfinished investigation into the disappearance of the royal infant 18 years earlier. He placed Charlotte's description beside the aging portrait and noticed similarities that reason alone could not dismiss. The shape of the eyes, the gentle curve of the smile. Even the small birthmark recorded in an old physician's notes matched what he had briefly noticed near her wrist while she carried the linens. Ethan leaned back in thoughtful silence. Coincidences existed, but experienced investigators knew that several impossible coincidences often pointed toward one hidden truth. At Greymoor Estate, Charlotte sat alone beneath the evening sky outside the servants' quarters. She reached into her apron pocket and discovered something she did not remember placing there. It was a tiny silver ribbon charm engraved with the same royal crest she had touched in the marketplace. She stared at it as cool wind moved through the trees, completely unaware that the first pieces of a secret protected for 18 years had quietly begun finding their way back to her. The following morning, a gentle rain settled over Ashbourne, leaving the cobblestone streets shining beneath pale daylight as Charlotte Hayes carried a wooden crate filled with fresh bread from Greymoor Estate to the village chapel. The familiar route usually passed in silence, but today every face seemed to linger on hers just a little longer. An elderly baker paused while arranging warm loaves in his shop window and smiled with unexpected kindness before quietly saying, "You remind me of someone this town has not seen in many years." Before Charlotte could ask what he meant, a customer interrupted the conversation, and the old man simply wished her a pleasant day. Charlotte continued walking, unable to understand why complete strangers kept speaking to her as though they carried memories she did not share. At the chapel, she placed the bread on a long wooden table where volunteers prepared meals for families in need. The elderly priest thanked her warmly and noticed the tiny silver ribbon charm resting beside her hand. His gentle expression suddenly changed. He looked at the charm, then at Charlotte, then back again. "Where did you find this?" he asked carefully. Charlotte admitted that she had discovered it inside her apron pocket without knowing how it had arrived there. The priest hesitated before replying that the symbol had once represented a promise made by the royal family to protect every child born into their bloodline. Realizing he had already said too much, he smiled politely and excused himself to greet another visitor, leaving Charlotte with even more questions than before. Across town, Ethan Ashford spent the morning inside the royal archives surrounded by towering shelves filled with aging journals, census records, and forgotten correspondence. He carefully compared birth registries, estate employment records, and reports written nearly 2 decades earlier. Every document seemed ordinary until one small inconsistency caught his attention. Greymoor Estate had officially hired an infant caretaker exactly 18 years before Charlotte had supposedly been found abandoned outside its gates. The caretaker's name appeared only once before disappearing from every public record. Ethan requested additional files, but the archive keeper quietly explained that several documents from that year had vanished during an inventory review many years ago. Missing records were unusual. Missing records connected to the disappearance of the royal heir were impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, Ethan visited a retired palace physician now living peacefully outside the capital. The elderly doctor listened patiently as Ethan described Charlotte without revealing her name. After a long silence, the The physician opened an old leather notebook and pointed toward a single handwritten observation recorded on the night the royal child had been born. A small crescent-shaped birthmark rested near the infant's left wrist. Ethan remembered seeing the same mark when Charlotte carried folded linens through Graymore Estate. He thanked the physician and quietly rode back toward the capital beneath gathering evening clouds. Meanwhile, Charlotte returned home carrying empty baskets and a heart filled with growing uncertainty. As she entered the servants' quarters, she noticed someone had carefully placed a folded piece of parchment beneath her pillow. There was no signature, no seal, and no explanation. Only one sentence appeared in careful handwriting. If you wish to know who you truly are, go to the old chapel garden tomorrow at sunrise and tell no one. Charlotte read the message again and again as the wind softly tapped against the small window beside her bed. For the first time in her life, the future seemed larger than Graymore Estate, and somewhere beyond its familiar walls, the truth had already begun moving toward her just as surely as she was beginning to move toward it. Charlotte Hayes barely slept that night. The unsigned message rested beneath her pillow until the first pale light of dawn crept through the small window of the servants' quarters. Every sensible thought urged her to ignore it, yet something deep inside insisted she had spent 18 years waiting for those exact words. Before the rest of Graymore Estate stirred awake, she quietly slipped through the side gate and followed the narrow stone path leading toward the old chapel garden. Morning mist floated across the grass while birds welcomed the new day with gentle songs. The abandoned garden looked peaceful, filled with weathered statues, climbing ivy, and ancient oak trees whose branches stretched above forgotten stone benches. Charlotte looked around carefully, but saw no one. Just as she wondered whether the message had been a cruel joke, a soft voice called her name. An elderly woman slowly emerged from behind the chapel wall, leaning on a wooden cane. Charlotte immediately recognized her. It was Margaret, the former nursery attendant who had disappeared from Graymore Estate many years earlier. Everyone had believed she had moved away after becoming too old to work. Margaret smiled sadly as tears gathered in her eyes. "You have grown into exactly the young woman your mother hoped you would become," she whispered. Charlotte felt her heart race. "You knew my mother?" she asked. Margaret nodded slowly before reaching into a worn leather satchel. Inside rested a carefully folded baby blanket embroidered with the same royal crest Charlotte had already seen twice before. Hidden within its fabric was a tiny gold bracelet engraved with two initials. C.H. Charlotte stared silently at the bracelet while Margaret explained that she had cared for a newborn girl 18 years earlier, but not inside Graymore Estate. She had cared for the child inside a private royal residence under strict orders to speak to no one. One stormy night, everything changed. The baby disappeared, the staff were dismissed, and every witness was instructed to forget what they had seen. Margaret had obeyed for years, believing silence would protect the innocent. "Why are you telling me now?" Charlotte asked softly. Margaret looked toward the distant palace rising beyond the hills. "Because too many people have spent too many years protecting lies instead of protecting you." Before Charlotte could ask another question, hurried footsteps echoed across the garden path. Margaret's expression changed instantly. She gently placed the bracelet into Charlotte's hands. "Hide this. Trust only those who seek evidence instead of power." Moments later, several estate servants appeared searching for Charlotte, explaining that the mistress of Graymore Estate had ordered everyone back immediately because important royal officials would soon return for another inspection. Margaret quietly disappeared through a side gate before anyone noticed her presence. Charlotte tucked the bracelet safely beneath her sleeve and walked back toward the estate, her mind overwhelmed by questions that no longer seemed impossible. At nearly the same hour, Ethan Ashford received a sealed letter delivered directly from the retired palace physician. Inside was a single page that had somehow escaped destruction 18 years earlier. It contained the physician's sworn statement describing the newborn royal daughter, including the embroidered blanket, the engraved bracelet bearing the initials Charlotte Hayes, and the emergency transfer ordered on the very night the child vanished. Ethan slowly folded the document and looked out across the capital. The investigation had finally crossed the line between suspicion and evidence. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, a young woman still believed she had been abandoned by the world, completely unaware that the first undeniable proof of her true identity now rested safely in two different hands. Charlotte Hayes spent the rest of the day moving through the familiar halls of Graymore Estate as though nothing had changed, but every ordinary task now carried extraordinary weight. Each polished window reflected questions instead of certainty. Each portrait hanging along the walls seemed to watch her with silent judgment. Hidden beneath the sleeve of her simple dress, the tiny gold bracelet rested against her wrist, its gentle weight reminding her that someone, somewhere, had expected her to have a very different life. She could not decide which frightened her more, the possibility that Margaret had spoken the truth or the possibility that she had not. Late that afternoon, the mistress of Graymore Estate announced that all servants were forbidden from entering the West Wing because royal inspectors would continue reviewing old estate records. Charlotte quietly nodded with everyone else, yet one detail caught her attention. The West Wing had remained locked for as long as she could remember. Why would forgotten ledgers suddenly matter after 18 years? Across the estate, Ethan Ashford arrived carrying official authorization from the Royal Archives. The estate owner greeted him with practiced hospitality, but Ethan noticed the tension hidden behind every polite smile. Several storage rooms had already been opened before his arrival, as though someone had hurried to organize their contents. Dust covered most of the shelves, yet one cabinet looked strangely clean, its brass handle polished more recently than everything around it. Ethan calmly requested permission to examine it. Inside, he found ordinary account books stacked with unusual precision. As he carefully lifted the final ledger, he discovered a false wooden panel concealed beneath the shelf. Hidden below rested a weathered journal wrapped in faded blue cloth. The estate owner immediately insisted the journal belonged to a former employee and contained nothing of value, but Ethan quietly opened the first page anyway. Written in elegant handwriting were daily nursery records from 18 years earlier. Most entries described feeding schedules, sleeping patterns, and routine care. Then one page stopped Ethan completely. The final completed entry read, "The child was moved before dawn under sealed instruction. Her blanket, bracelet, and identification ribbon remained with Nurse Margaret for future protection." The remaining pages had been carefully removed. Ethan closed the journal without revealing his thoughts. Someone had deliberately erased the ending, but they had overlooked the sentence that connected Margaret directly to the missing royal infant. Meanwhile, Charlotte finished preparing evening tea for the household when one of the youngest kitchen assistants quietly approached her. The nervous girl glanced around to make certain nobody was listening before slipping a folded piece of parchment into Charlotte's hand. "An old groundskeeper asked me to give you this," she whispered before quickly returning to work. Charlotte waited until sunset before unfolding the note inside the privacy of the servants' quarters. A simple hand-drawn map appeared beside a brief message. The truth they tried to hide was never destroyed. Follow the path beneath the old chapel after tomorrow's evening bell. Charlotte traced the faded lines with her fingertips as her heartbeat steadily quickened. At nearly the same moment, Ethan carefully placed the recovered journal beside the physician's sworn statement and Margaret's recorded employment file. Three independent pieces of evidence now pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. The investigation was no longer about discovering whether the missing royal child had survived. It had become a race to uncover every remaining secret before those determined to protect the past realized that the future was already beginning to remember itself. The following day moved with unsettling calm, as though the entire kingdom had agreed to hold its breath. Charlotte Hayes completed every assignment exactly as she always had, sweeping long corridors, arranging fresh flowers inside the grand dining room, and carrying polished silver trays through elegant halls that had never truly felt like home. Yet every passing hour brought her closer to the evening bell and the mysterious map hidden safely beneath her mattress. She noticed subtle changes around the estate that others seemed determined to ignore. Locked cabinets stood open for only a few moments before being sealed again. Clerks quietly removed aging ledgers from shelves and carried them away without explanation. Several longtime servants exchanged nervous glances whenever royal inspectors appeared. Even the estate owner seemed unusually restless, forcing cheerful conversations that ended the instant anyone mentioned old records or the events of 18 years earlier. Charlotte understood almost nothing about politics or royal history, but she understood people. Everyone around her behaved like someone protecting a fragile secret. Across the estate grounds, Ethan Ashford continued his careful investigation with steady patience. Rather than confronting anyone directly, he listened more than he spoke. The oldest workers often revealed the most valuable details without realizing it. A retired gardener casually mentioned that the West Garden had once contained a private nursery before being demolished many years earlier. An elderly stable master recalled delivering a covered carriage to the estate during a violent rainstorm exactly 18 years ago, although no official visitor had ever been recorded. Every quiet memory added another piece to the growing puzzle. By late afternoon, Ethan gathered enough evidence to convince himself that the missing pages from the nursery journal had not been destroyed inside Graymore Estate. Someone had removed them before the estate records were sealed. The question was where they had gone. As sunset painted the sky with deep shades of gold and crimson, the chapel bell echoed across the valley. Charlotte quietly slipped away from the servants' quarters, carrying only a small lantern and the folded map. The narrow path behind the abandoned chapel led through overgrown hedges until it reached an ancient stone arch nearly hidden beneath climbing ivy. Following the faded markings, she discovered a narrow staircase descending beneath the old garden. The underground passage felt cool and silent, its stone walls lined with forgotten carvings that had faded through generations. At the end of the corridor stood a small wooden door that opened into a hidden chamber no larger than a simple study. Dust covered the shelves, yet several objects remained carefully preserved beneath linen cloths. Charlotte slowly uncovered a carved wooden cradle decorated with the same royal crest she had seen on the silver emblem, the ribbon charm, and the tiny bracelet. Beside it rested a beautifully bound journal tied with blue ribbon. Before she could open it, footsteps echoed from the entrance tunnel. Her heart raced until Ethan Ashford stepped into the chamber, holding a lantern of his own. Both stopped in complete surprise. Neither had expected the other to be there. For several quiet seconds, they simply looked at one another, each realizing they had been following different paths toward the same hidden destination. Ethan gently lowered his lantern and spoke with calm sincerity. "I believe someone wanted both of us to find this place." Charlotte glanced at the untouched journal resting between them. For the first time since her ordinary life began unraveling, she no longer felt completely alone. Whatever truth had been buried beneath the kingdom for 18 years had patiently waited until this very moment for two strangers to uncover it together. Charlotte Hayes slowly stepped toward the weathered journal, while Ethan Ashford remained respectfully beside the doorway, allowing her to decide whether the hidden record should finally be opened. The silence inside the underground chamber felt almost sacred, broken only by the soft crackle of their lanterns. Charlotte carefully untied the faded blue ribbon and lifted the heavy cover. The first pages contained handwritten nursery observations, gentle notes describing the laughter of an infant who smiled whenever she heard music and reached for the silver ribbon attached to her blanket. Charlotte felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest, as though the words carried distant echoes she had never consciously remembered. As the entries continued, the handwriting became increasingly anxious. The caretaker described unfamiliar visitors arriving after sunset, whispered meetings behind locked doors, and growing fear that the child entrusted to her care would soon disappear. Then Charlotte reached a folded letter hidden between two pages. It had been written by the woman identified only as Nurse Margaret. The message explained that if anyone ever discovered the journal, they should know the child had never been abandoned. She had been protected. Margaret wrote that powerful people believed removing the infant from the palace was the only way to preserve stability during a dangerous political struggle. She admitted that remaining silent had become the greatest regret of her life because the innocent child had paid the highest price by growing up without knowing who she truly was. Charlotte lowered the letter with trembling hands. Ethan quietly examined the remaining pages until another document slipped free. It was an unfinished map showing several locations connected by careful markings, including the private royal residence, Graymore Estate, the old chapel, and one final destination inside the capital that had been circled in dark ink. Beside it appeared a short handwritten instruction. The complete record remains inside the Hall of Royal Memory. Ethan immediately recognized the building. It had once served as the kingdom's official archive before newer facilities replaced it decades earlier. Very few people still remembered its existence. Before either of them could discuss the discovery, faint voices echoed from somewhere beyond the hidden staircase. Someone else had entered the underground passage. Ethan gently closed the journal and lowered the lantern flame until the chamber rested in near darkness. The distant conversation drifted closer, but the words remained impossible to understand. After several long moments, the footsteps gradually faded away, leaving only silence once again. Charlotte released the breath she had been holding. "Do you think they were looking for this place?" she asked quietly. Ethan answered with complete honesty. "I believe someone else knows the truth is beginning to surface. That means we cannot leave evidence where it can disappear again." Together, they carefully wrapped the journal, the letter, and the map inside a protective cloth before leaving the chamber exactly as they had found it. As they emerged beneath the evening sky, the first stars appeared above the valley. Charlotte looked toward the distant palace glowing softly on the horizon, realizing that every answer she had searched for throughout her life now seemed to be waiting there. Ethan studied the map one final time before folding it into his coat. The hidden archive inside the capital had become their next destination, and somewhere within its forgotten halls rested the final pieces of a story that had remained unfinished for 18 long years. Charlotte Hayes and Ethan Ashford left the abandoned chapel under the quiet cover of dawn, carrying the carefully wrapped journal, Margaret's letter, and the unfinished map hidden inside an ordinary canvas satchel that gave no hint of its importance. Neither of them spoke during the first mile of the journey. The silence was not uncomfortable. Both understood that every answer they had uncovered had only revealed deeper questions waiting inside the forgotten hall of royal memory. As they followed the old forest road toward the capital, Ethan finally broke the silence by explaining what little he knew about the abandoned archive. Decades earlier, it had housed every royal birth record, ceremonial document, and private correspondence before a new archive was constructed inside the palace grounds. Most people believed the old building had been emptied, but experienced investigators understood that governments rarely moved every document. Forgotten rooms often protected forgotten truths. Charlotte listened carefully while holding the small gold bracelet inside her hand. For the first time in her life, someone treated her opinions with genuine respect instead of giving orders. Ethan never spoke to her as though she were a servant. He asked questions, listened to her observations, and considered every detail she remembered from Greymore Estate. The simple kindness felt unfamiliar. By midday, they reached the outskirts of the capital where crowded streets bustled with merchants, musicians, craftsmen, and families enjoying the lively marketplace. Charlotte had visited the city only a handful of times, always carrying supplies for the estate, never as someone searching for her own past. As they crossed the central square, an elderly woman selling handmade ribbons looked directly at Charlotte before quietly smiling. Without asking for payment, she selected a pale blue ribbon and gently placed it into Charlotte's hands. "Some things always find their way home," she said softly before returning to her work. Charlotte looked back only a moment later, but the woman had already disappeared into the crowd. Ethan noticed the exchange, but chose not to interrupt. He had learned that the smallest moments often carried the greatest meaning. By late afternoon, they arrived at the forgotten hall of royal memory. The grand stone building stood untouched behind iron gates covered with climbing ivy. Tall windows reflected the fading sunlight while layers of dust softened the once magnificent entrance. Ethan unlocked the weathered front door using an old investigator's key issued years earlier for historical inquiries. Inside, endless shelves stretched beneath towering ceilings where sunlight filtered through stained glass in long beams of gold. Dust floated peacefully through the quiet air. Time itself seemed to have stopped inside the forgotten archive. Guided by the unfinished map, they walked through narrow aisles until they reached a circular reading room hidden behind a carved wooden partition. At its center stood a large stone table surrounded by locked cabinets marked with faded royal seals. One cabinet matched the symbol engraved upon Charlotte's bracelet exactly. She carefully rested her hand against the old metal lock. Before anyone searched for a hidden key, the mechanism released with a gentle click all by itself. Charlotte slowly opened the cabinet and discovered a beautifully crafted wooden box lined with deep blue velvet. Resting inside was a sealed envelope bearing the royal crest and a single handwritten sentence addressed to no one else. To my daughter, if destiny ever returns you here. Charlotte stared silently at the untouched letter while Ethan stepped back without speaking. After 18 years of unanswered questions, someone from the past had left behind a message meant only for the young woman who had never known she was expected to find it. Charlotte Hayes stood motionless before the velvet-lined wooden box as her fingertips hovered above the sealed envelope that had waited 18 years to be discovered. The elegant handwriting seemed almost impossible to believe. It did not address a princess, a noblewoman, or an unknown heir. It simply spoke to a daughter who might one day find her way home. Ethan Ashford remained several steps behind, understanding that some moments belonged only to the person living them. Charlotte carefully lifted the envelope and noticed the wax seal remained perfectly preserved despite the passing years. Taking a slow breath, she gently broke the seal and unfolded the neatly written letter inside. The graceful handwriting belonged to Queen Eleanor, the woman history remembered as having tragically lost her only infant daughter without ever learning the child's fate. Charlotte quietly began reading. The letter explained that if these words were ever found, it would mean hope had survived where certainty had failed. The queen wrote that she had never believed her daughter had truly disappeared. She trusted that loyal people had acted not out of betrayal, but out of desperate love to protect an innocent child during a dangerous struggle for influence inside the royal court. She begged her daughter not to allow anger to define the life that destiny had returned to her. Instead, she hoped the truth would become a bridge toward healing rather than another source of division. As Charlotte finished the final sentence, tears filled her eyes, not from sorrow alone, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had loved her every day, even across 18 years of silence. Beneath the letter rested another carefully folded document bearing the official royal seal. Ethan stepped forward only after Charlotte silently handed it to him. It was the original birth registry of the missing royal daughter, complete with the physician's signature, ceremonial witnesses, and a detailed description of the newborn, including the crescent-shaped birthmark near the left wrist, the embroidered blanket, the silver ribbon, and the engraved bracelet that Charlotte now carried. Every piece of evidence collected over recent days aligned perfectly with the official record preserved inside the Forgotten Archive. Ethan slowly lowered the document and looked at Charlotte with quiet respect. "This is the confirmation I have spent years searching for," he said softly. "There is no longer any reasonable doubt." Charlotte looked around the silent archive, struggling to understand how the frightened servant she had believed herself to be could exist alongside the truth unfolding before her. She did not feel like royalty. She still remembered cold mornings carrying heavy buckets across stone floors and believing she had been forgotten by everyone. Ethan gently reminded her that identity was not created by privilege but by character, and the compassion she had shown throughout her life had been entirely her own. Before they could continue examining the remaining contents of the cabinet, they discovered one final item hidden beneath the registry. It was an official invitation prepared many years earlier but never delivered. The elegant script announced a ceremonial presentation of the royal infant before the kingdom on the day following her first birthday. The event had never taken place. Charlotte quietly folded the invitation beside her mother's letter, realizing that an entire future had once been planned for a child who instead grew up believing she belonged nowhere. As evening light streamed through the stained glass windows of the Forgotten Archive, both Charlotte and Ethan understood that uncovering the truth had only completed half of their journey. The greater challenge still lay ahead, because the kingdom itself had not yet heard the story that history had hidden for nearly 2 decades. The morning sun rose over the capital with unusual brilliance as Charlotte Hayes and Ethan Ashford quietly left the forgotten hall of royal memory, carrying the carefully protected documents inside a plain leather satchel. The city bustled with ordinary life, yet everything felt different to Charlotte. Only days earlier she had walked these same streets believing she was an unnoticed servant delivering supplies for Greymore Estate. Now every familiar building reminded her that the life she had accepted had been built upon a carefully protected secret. Ethan suggested that before presenting any evidence, they should verify every document through the Royal Council of Records, the one institution whose responsibility was preserving official history regardless of politics or personal influence. Charlotte agreed without hesitation. She had no desire to accuse anyone. She wanted only the truth. By late morning, they entered the stately council building where historians, archivists, legal scholars, and royal record keepers carefully examined ancient manuscripts beneath tall, stained glass windows. Ethan formally presented the physician's sworn statement, Margaret's letter, the nursery journal, the original birth registry, the engraved bracelet, the embroidered blanket, and Queen Eleanor's sealed message. The council members quietly separated each item, comparing handwriting, wax seals, signatures, paper fibers, official registry numbers, and ceremonial markings that could not easily be duplicated. Hours passed in respectful silence while Charlotte waited beside a large window overlooking the palace gardens. She wondered whether the queen had ever stood in the same sunlight hoping her daughter would somehow return. Finally, the senior archivist slowly approached carrying the complete collection of documents. His expression revealed neither excitement nor doubt, only quiet certainty. He announced that every record had passed authentication. The signatures matched official royal archives. The ceremonial seals were genuine. The physician's notes aligned perfectly with preserved medical records. The birth registry had never been altered. The bracelet, blanket, and ribbon corresponded exactly with the descriptions recorded on the day of the royal birth. After nearly 18 years, the complete historical record stood reunited. Ethan thanked the council before asking the question that mattered most. What happens now? The senior archivist answered that the evidence required formal presentation before the Royal Assembly, where the reigning monarch and council would publicly acknowledge the restored historical record. Such a proceeding had not occurred in generations. News of the extraordinary review quietly spread through administrative offices long before the official announcement could be prepared. Courtiers whispered in marble corridors. Clerks exchanged astonished glances. Elderly palace employees remembered old rumors they had dismissed decades earlier. Meanwhile, Charlotte remained remarkably calm. She did not ask about crowns, titles, or privilege. Instead, she looked toward Ethan and softly asked whether the people who had raised her through difficult years would be judged fairly if they had acted to protect her rather than deceive her. Ethan answered that justice was strongest when guided by truth instead of resentment, and Charlotte's first question proved exactly why she deserved to know her own story. As evening approached, an official messenger arrived carrying an elegant royal invitation embossed with the kingdom's seal. The Royal Assembly would convene at first light the following morning, and Charlotte Hayes was respectfully requested to attend as the central witness in a matter concerning the restoration of the kingdom's historical record. She quietly folded the invitation beside her mother's letter, realizing that the next sunrise would not simply change her future. It would finally allow an entire kingdom to hear the truth that had waited patiently through 18 silent years. Charlotte Hayes stood quietly at the entrance of the Royal Assembly Hall as the massive oak doors slowly opened before her. Golden morning light poured through towering stained glass windows, illuminating rows of council members, historians, judges, military leaders, and distinguished citizens who had gathered for a session unlike any witnessed in generations. Every conversation faded into silence as Charlotte entered beside Ethan Ashford. She wore the same simple cream dress she had owned for years, refusing expensive garments that had been offered for the occasion because she wanted the truth to stand on its own rather than be strengthened by appearances. Ethan carried the leather satchel containing every authenticated document recovered during their investigation. Together they walked across the polished marble floor toward the center of the chamber, where the Royal Council of Records had prepared a long table displaying the physician's statement, the nursery journal, Margaret's letter, Queen Eleanor's sealed message, the original birth registry, the embroidered blanket, the silver ribbon, and the engraved bracelet. The senior archivist rose and formally addressed the assembly, explaining that every document had undergone independent examination by the kingdom's highest historical authorities. One by one, the evidence was presented in chronological order, allowing every member of the assembly to follow the forgotten story exactly as it had unfolded 18 years earlier. No dramatic accusations were made. No voices were raised. Only carefully preserved facts spoke for themselves. The physician confirmed the birth records. The archivists verified every royal seal. Handwriting experts authenticated Queen Eleanor's letter. The nursery journal matched official palace schedules. Margaret's testimony explained how the child had been protected rather than abandoned. As each document joined the next, an uninterrupted historical record emerged with remarkable clarity. Quiet astonishment spread throughout the chamber. Several elderly council members lowered their heads as memories they had long dismissed suddenly became impossible to ignore. The reigning monarch slowly rose from the royal seat and approached Charlotte with calm dignity. Looking first at the assembled council and then at the young woman before him, he spoke with measured sincerity. History has waited 18 years for this moment. Today we do not create a new truth. We acknowledge the one that has patiently endured. He gently lifted the original birth registry so everyone present could see the official record bearing the royal seal. The chamber remained completely silent as the senior archivist announced the formal conclusion reached unanimously by the council. Charlotte Hayes had been conclusively identified as the missing royal daughter whose disappearance had remained unresolved for nearly 2 decades. No applause followed the announcement. Instead, an atmosphere of profound respect settled over the hall. Those who had once believed the disappearance would never be explained now witnessed history restoring itself through patience, evidence, and integrity. Charlotte stood motionless, overwhelmed not by thoughts of status, but by the realization that her mother had never stopped believing she would one day be found. Ethan quietly stepped back, satisfied that his role had always been to uncover facts rather than seek recognition. As the assembly prepared the official proclamation that would be shared throughout the kingdom before sunset, Charlotte looked across the great hall where portraits of generations past lined the walls. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like a stranger searching for a place to belong. She finally understood that the greatest inheritance she had recovered was not a royal title, but the truth that love, courage, and faithful remembrance had quietly protected her identity until the day the entire kingdom was finally ready to remember it. The official proclamation spread across the kingdom before sunset, carried by royal messengers, church bells, and handwritten notices placed in every town square. Everywhere the same message appeared. The identity of the missing royal daughter had been officially restored through verified historical records, authenticated testimony, and preserved royal archives. Inside the palace, Charlotte Hayes quietly watched the evening sky through a tall window while the celebration unfolding beyond the walls seemed strangely distant. She had not spent 18 years dreaming of becoming royalty. She had spent 18 years hoping to understand why she had always felt different. Ethan Ashford joined her carrying several newly delivered reports prepared by the Royal Council. Independent investigators had completed their final review of everyone connected to the disappearance. Their findings revealed that many people once believed responsible had actually acted to protect the infant during a dangerous political struggle rather than seeking personal gain. Margaret had accepted a lifetime of silence to keep the child hidden from those who wished to control the royal succession. Several palace servants had secretly preserved documents instead of destroying them, carefully passing evidence from one trusted guardian to another across nearly 2 decades. Even Greymore Estate had unknowingly become part of that quiet chain of protection after Charlotte had been raised there under a false history. The reigning monarch ordered every surviving participant to be formally acknowledged for preserving historical truth whenever possible, instead of allowing rumor to replace evidence. Charlotte listened carefully before asking about the family who had raised her. Ethan smiled gently and explained that the investigation found no proof they had known her true identity. They had believed the official story given to them many years earlier. Relief softened Charlotte's expression. She had feared that gratitude and truth might force her to stand on opposite sides, but instead they remained together. The following morning, Charlotte requested permission to visit Greymore Estate one final time before accepting any royal responsibilities. The request surprised many advisors, yet the monarch immediately approved it. Upon arriving, Charlotte found the servants gathered quietly in the central courtyard. The same people who had worked beside her every day now looked uncertain about how they should greet her. Charlotte solved their uncertainty by smiling warmly and thanking each of them for every act of kindness, no matter how small, that had helped shape the person she had become. She embraced the elderly housemaid who had once whispered that Charlotte carried her mother's smile. She thanked the young kitchen assistant who had secretly delivered the mysterious note. She even visited the simple room where she had slept since childhood, taking one final look at the small window through which she had once imagined a larger world. Nothing inside the room had changed, yet everything within her had. Before leaving the estate, Charlotte placed the little silver ribbon charm on the windowsill. It had guided her toward the truth, but she no longer needed an object to remind her who she was. Her identity now lived within her heart, instead of hidden inside forgotten symbols. As the royal carriage carried Charlotte and Ethan back toward the capital beneath a bright afternoon sky, crowds gathered peacefully along the roadside. They did not cheer because of wealth or status. They simply removed their hats, offered respectful smiles, and welcomed home a young woman whose greatest strength had never been royal blood. It had always been the grace with which she treated others long before anyone knew her true name. 5 years passed, and the story that had once begun with a frightened young servant kneeling in a crowded marketplace slowly became one of the most respected chapters in the kingdom's history. Princess Charlotte Hayes never allowed the comforts of palace life to erase the lessons she had learned while growing up among ordinary people. Instead of surrounding herself only with nobles, she regularly visited villages, schools, workshops, and family farms, believing that the strength of a kingdom could never be measured by the height of its palace walls, but by the dignity with which every citizen was treated. The Royal Council introduced new laws requiring every child, regardless of family, wealth, or social position, to receive official birth registration protected within multiple independent archives so that no identity could ever disappear again. Historical records were preserved with greater care, and every important decision involving succession required transparent documentation reviewed by several trusted institutions. Ethan Ashford accepted a permanent position as royal historian, not because he desired prestige, but because he believed truth deserved lifelong guardianship. Together, he and Charlotte established the Hall of Royal Memory as a public museum where visitors could learn how forgotten documents, quiet acts of courage, and ordinary people had protected history when power alone could not. Margaret's name was engraved upon a marble wall honoring those whose loyalty had preserved innocent lives through sacrifice rather than recognition. Charlotte often visited that memorial alone, placing fresh white flowers beneath Margaret's name without inviting photographers or public ceremonies. She never forgot that her future had been protected by people who expected nothing in return. Greymoor Estate also changed. The harsh traditions that had defined generations gradually disappeared, replaced by fair employment, education, and opportunity for every worker. The small room where Charlotte had once slept remained untouched, preserved exactly as she had left it, serving as a quiet reminder that greatness can emerge from the most humble beginnings when kindness refuses to surrender to hardship. Visitors from distant kingdoms frequently asked Charlotte what it felt like to discover she had been born into royalty after believing herself to be someone entirely different. She always answered with the same gentle smile. She explained that learning her true family gave her a history, but the years spent serving others had given her character. One could never replace the other. On warm spring afternoons, Charlotte sometimes walked through the capital without announcing her arrival, greeting merchants, craftsmen, children, and elderly neighbors who now welcomed her not because of a royal title, but because they recognized the same compassionate young woman they had always known. Many people still remembered the day she had been humiliated for touching a royal crest she did not know already belonged to her. That memory remained important because it reminded the kingdom that appearances could never reveal the full value of a human life. As the evening sun settled behind the palace towers one peaceful day, Charlotte stood beside the restored royal garden where her mother had once dreamed of watching her daughter grow. She quietly looked toward the horizon, carrying no anger for the years that had been lost, only gratitude for the truth that had finally found its way home. The kingdom learned that crowns may symbolize authority, but integrity earns respect, compassion creates lasting strength, and the greatest inheritance any person can receive is not power or privilege, but the courage to remain kind even before the world discovers who they truly are.